My daughter's urgent whisper. "We have to run, Mommy. Now," was the first sign something was terribly wrong. My husband had just left for his business trip, promising we'd be perfectly safe. But the air was already growing thick and hot. And as the roar of a fire started to build from downstairs, I realized his promise wasn't for our safety. It was the final seal on our tomb. The air was no longer breathable. It was thick, oily, and hot, tasting of burning synthetic chemicals and old plaster. Caroline's lungs screamed for release, but the roar of the fire downstairs swallowed every sound of her distress, leaving only a small, clear voice right beside her ear. "Mommy," Sophie whispered, her hand gripping Caroline's nightgown with unnatural strength. Her 6-year-old face, usually flushed and vibrant, was pale and unnervingly calm beneath the swirling smoke. "Grandma told me, we have to run. Now." "Run? Where?" The Miller estate, built of granite and old money, had always been a fortress against the world, never a cage. Now, the heavy oak door to the hallway was glowing with an infernal pulsing heat, and the elaborate security system, recently upgraded at Daniel's insistence, offered not protection, but sealing. It was a prison designed and built by the very man who had promised Caroline a life of safety and perfection. That perfection had been the facade, thin and brittle, covering the rot beneath. It had started subtly, not with flames, but with the slow, insidious chill that had replaced Daniel's affection over the last year. He had become obsessed with the legacy, the estate, the investment portfolios, the massive sums of money Caroline inherited after her mother passed away 6 months prior. Daniel called it optimizing. Caroline called it being systematically erased. The tension was a constant, low thrum, often amplified by Evelyn, Daniel's mother, who glided through the antique-filled rooms offering cold, backhanded compliments that felt less like conversation and more like tiny, precise cuts. "You look terribly drawn, dear," Evelyn had commented just last week, examining Caroline over the rim of her delicate teacup, her expression a mask of concerned scrutiny. "Daniel handles so much stress. You really should let him take care of the details. All those papers. Best to sign them and clear your mind for more pleasant things." Caroline had been isolated, worn down by the constant need to prove her competence to her mother-in-law and the growing chilling realization that her husband no longer saw her as a partner, but as a financial obstacle. But now, the emotional friction had materialized into physical, deadly reality. The chilling certainty in Sophie's voice was what truly broke through Caroline's rising panic. Sophie was only 6. Yet she spoke now with the strange, quiet authority of the elderly woman who had passed away. Caroline's mother, Grandma. Grandma had loved Sophie fiercely, sharing an intense bond that Caroline had often watched with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. Lately, Sophie had begun murmuring phrases in low, rapid Vietnamese that Grandma had used to say, often just before something bad happened, phrases about patience and shadows. Grandma said the walls, "Listen, Mommy," Sophie repeated, pulling Caroline, not toward the sealed windows or the burning door, but toward the small, untouched pantry near the kitchen wing. She said, "The dark places are the safest now. We need the door." Caroline stumbled, dragging air through her clenched teeth. The Miller family had lived here for generations. She knew every room, every closet, every hidden space for silver storage. There was no door in the pantry. But Sophie wasn't looking at the canned goods or the spices. She was staring at the back wall, a solid expanse of century-old plaster and paint, her small brow furrowed in concentration. The smoke was too thick to ignore now, forcing Caroline to crouch low, pulling Sophie tightly against her chest, listening to the crackling fire consume the life they had pretended to live. "The dark places, Mummy. Hurry. Before Daniel comes back." Caroline felt the plaster behind her head cold and unyielding, a cruel contrast to the intense heat pressing in from the corridor. She followed Sophie's gaze to the back wall of the pantry, desperately searching the solid surface for some seam, some weakness, that her panic had overlooked. Asterisk, no door. Asterisk. There was only the wall and the overwhelming, choking terror. Asterisk. Before Daniel comes back. Asterisk. The phrase, spoken with such chilling certainty by her daughter, sliced through the adrenaline haze, dragging Caroline's mind, screaming, back 6 months, to the moment the facade of their perfect marriage first cracked. It had begun with a heavy brass key. A week after Grandma's private funeral, Caroline had been presented with the key to a small, unremarkable safe deposit box Grandma had maintained for 30 years, separate from the sprawling Miller estate holdings. Inside, Caroline found no jewels or large sums of cash. Only a stack of brittle, handwritten notes in fastidious Vietnamese, and heavily annotated architectural sketches, not of the Miller house as it currently stood, but of the Times foundation's times beneath it, detailed in ways no modern blueprint would ever show. Grandma had always been secretive about her connection to the Miller family's initial business ventures. A history lost to polite conversation. Caroline, painstakingly translating the notes over several quiet weeks, learned more about the house's origins than she had known in 5 years of marriage. One note was particularly cryptic. Hidden inside a rolled-up drawing of the basement cistern. The old house breathes on its own. Watch the darkness. Keep the light close. Do not trust the guardians of the stone. Daniel, already obsessed with maximizing every cent of the inheritance, barely acknowledged the sentimental value of the papers when Caroline mentioned them. He was too busy planning renovations, he called them. Suddenly, the ancient house, which had been stable for a century, required structural reinforcements in the basement and a complete overhaul of the security system. He kept pushing papers across the mahogany desk, waivers, permits, contracts, always urging her to sign quickly. It's all standard documentation, darling, he'd say, leaning over her shoulder, his breath unnervingly cold on her neck. Just authorizing the expenditure? We need these repairs done quickly so we can enjoy our future. Nothing for your pretty head to worry about. His eyes, however, lacked the warmth of a loving husband, and shone only with the predatory gleam of projected wealth. Caroline? Distracted by grief and intimidated by Evelyn's constant, subtle presence always confirming Daniel's necessity, and Caroline's incompetence often signed. She believed in the facade of perfection too much to question the architect of her own life. As Daniel's financial pressure mounted, Sophie's odd behavior escalated. The child who used to chatter incessantly became withdrawn, often speaking in low, rapid Vietnamese phrases she shouldn't know. She would wake up crying, pointing toward the floor. Once, while they were planting flowers near the foundation, Sophie had traced the stone with a dirty finger and whispered, "Grandma says we must feed the darkness to find the light, Mommy. It smells like waiting." When Caroline asked what she meant, Sophie had simply stared, her eyes holding the profound, unsettling sadness of someone much older than 6. Caroline had dismissed it as complicated grief, a child struggling to process the loss of her closest confidant, but now, standing amidst the suffocating smoke, the phrase echoed with horrifying clarity. The dark places Grandma spoke of were not metaphors. They were real tunnels, real secrets embedded in the stone of this monstrous, beautiful house. Daniel hadn't been renovating, he had been time-sealing asterisk. He had used the language of repair and enhancement to build his crematorium. The smoke choked her, dragging her back from the 6-month-old memory and into the terrifying heat of the present. This was the moment of reckoning, the final price for her complacency and trust. The burning air stung her eyes, but she focused fiercely on Sophie, whose small, steady finger was now tracing the faint, almost invisible seam running horizontally across the old pantry wall, exactly where a hidden junction had been indicated in one of Grandma's cryptic sketches. "The door, Mommy," Sophie urged again. The calmness in her voice now the single fragile tether holding Caroline to reality. "Push the stone where the snake sleeps." The heat that radiated from the pantry wall was nothing compared to the searing, absolute horror of the realization that had burned through Caroline's perfect marriage 6 weeks earlier. That moment, unlike the flames consuming the house now, had been silent, a cold, sickening drop into reality that made her gasp for breath in a well-lit room, just as she was gasping for air now in the smoke. It had been a Tuesday morning. Daniel was late for a meeting, rushing out the door and cursing under his breath about a crucial document he couldn't find. He rarely let any financial correspondence cross her desk. But as he swept past, a large, official-looking envelope slipped from his briefcase, tumbling under the antique console table. He didn't notice. Caroline watched him drive away, her heart hammering a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. Something told her not to mention the envelope. It felt like a tiny, heavy piece of forbidden fruit. She retrieved it. It was thick, glossy paper, embossed with the logo of a major offshore insurer she had never heard of. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slit the seal. She expected to see details about the refinancing Daniel was always vaguely discussing, or perhaps another convoluted contract requiring her signature. What she found instead was a life insurance policy, a massive one, $5 million. Caroline stood in the hallway, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, suddenly feeling cold and artificial. The air crystallized around the number, $5 million, printed in bold black type. That figure alone was enough to make her hands shake, but the real punch came on the very next line. Asterisk beneficiary. Daniel Miller, husband. Asterisk, not Caroline, not Sophie, just Daniel. Her mind immediately tried to construct reasonable explanations, a mistake, a default setup, perhaps an old policy he forgot to update, but the date on the document was only 4 weeks old. Purchased immediately following Grandma's death, and the resulting influx of inheritance, the perfection snapped. The thin facade that Daniel and Evelyn had so carefully maintained shattered, exposing the dark, ugly mechanism beneath. Daniel didn't want a future with her. He wanted her dead, and legally, lucratively dead. Caroline retreated to the quiet sanctity of Daniel's study. The room smelled of leather and ambition, usually oppressive but now feeling strangely protective. She didn't dare confront him. She pictured the conversation. Daniel's icy denial, Evelyn's patronizing support, the ease with which they could twist the situation back onto her. Asterisk, you're hysterical, dear. It's a standard clause for tax purposes. You've always been so prone to anxiety. Asterisk, she knew confrontation would be suicide. She had to gather proof. Working swiftly, her movements practiced and silent as if she were stealing from her own life. Caroline pulled out her phone. She laid the policy flat on the mahogany desk and photographed every single page, zooming in on the dollar amount and the beneficiary line until the numbers were perfectly sharp and indisputable. She then uploaded the photos to a secure, cloud-based folder she knew Daniel could never access. She carefully sealed the envelope shut again, using a hairdryer to remelt the adhesive, and slid it into the exact crevice of his briefcase from which it had fallen. When Daniel returned that evening, he was jovial, almost excessively so. He kissed her cheek, asked about Sophie, and announced his urgent news over dinner. Geneva, he said, carving the roast with unnecessary precision. 5 days. It's unavoidable, darling. A massive restructuring opportunity I simply can't pass up. He insisted she and Sophie stay home. Security system upgrade, remember? They're doing the final wiring in the basement starting tomorrow. The house will be a bit of a mess, and the workers don't need distractions. Besides, he added, his eyes briefly meeting hers with a cold intensity that now seemed terrifyingly meaningful, I need to know my 2 girls are safe and sound right here until I return. Safe and sound. As Daniel packed his sleek carbon fiber luggage, Caroline watched him, the $5 million burning a hole in the back of her mind. She realized his renovations were complete. His alibi was secured, and his grand exit was scheduled. The cage had been set, and the arsonist was stepping out to establish his perfect cover story. It wasn't a business trip, it was the countdown. The silence Daniel left behind was not peaceful, it was a vacuum. Cold and heavy, allowing the truth to settle like ash. Caroline walked through the huge, echoing house, every shadow seeming longer, every creak of the old floorboards sounding like an intruder. It was the vast, suffocating quiet of a sophisticated trap. Less than 4 hours after Daniel's sleek black sedan disappeared down the drive, The phone rang, shattering the fragile peace. It was Evelyn. "Darling, just checking in." Evelyn's voice purred, smooth and excessively sweet. "Daniel was so worried about leaving you. With the house half finished, security compromised, and all. Are you managing?" Caroline's grip tightened on the receiver. Evelyn wasn't checking times on times her. She was checking times up, times on the plan's execution. "We're fine, Evelyn. Just settling in," Caroline managed, forcing a casual lightness into her voice that felt like acid on her tongue. "Good, good. Daniel mentioned the contractors would be on site this afternoon to disable the old wiring. Don't worry if things go dark for a bit. It's all part of the upgrade. Disable the old wiring. Caroline remembered Daniel specifically saying they were upgrading the security, not turning it off. "Right. The security upgrade," Caroline repeated woodenly. "Exactly. So, no running off to friends now. The whole point is for you and dear Sophie to be secure and untouched by the construction dust. Stay put, darling. Daniel will be so relieved to find you both right where he left you." The emphasis on stay put times was not a suggestion, it was an instruction, delivered with the casual menace of a velvet curtain dropping on a stage. The call ended, leaving Caroline slick with cold sweat. The house kept its word. That afternoon, the entire system, the modern motion sensors, the intercom, the external cameras went dark with an unsettling, definitive click. The electronic eyes of the house had been blinded. Then the repairman arrived. He wasn't wearing a branded uniform, just dark, anonymous work clothes. He was heavy-set, moved with an economy of motion that suggested practiced efficiency. And he did not greet Caroline when she watched him through the dusty, leaded glass of the kitchen window. He went straight to the service entrance, the massive, hidden door leading to the wine cellar and storage rooms. Daniel had spent weeks refinishing. Caroline watched, paralyzed, as he retrieved something from his large toolkit that was not wire cutters or a drill, but a length of heavy chain and a substantial, institutional-grade padlock. He wrapped the chain tightly around the thick iron door handles, clicked the lock shut, and tested it with a rough jerk. Satisfied, he moved silently to the cellar access hatch beneath the sunroom. The panic that had been simmering finally boiled over. Caroline snatched Sophie's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house, away from the man, toward the formal sitting room with its expansive front windows. She tried the heavy brass latch. Locked. Not from the inside with the simple thumb turn, but sealed from the exterior. She saw the glint of new metal, the same ominous gray as the repairman's padlock, holding the sash firmly shut. The trap was closing. Daniel hadn't planned a 5-day delay. He had given them just enough time for the physical sealing to be completed. He wanted the house to burn without anyone, firefighters or police, being able to access the property quickly, buying time for the fire to consume the evidence and the occupants. Caroline stumbled backward, her breath ragged. She ran from room to room, the library, the back parlor, the conservatory, testing every external point. Each door, each ground floor window, was sealed, either by the newly disabled security deadbolts or the physical application of the heavy chains. She rushed upstairs to the second floor, considering the risk of a jump, but the sheer drop onto the rocky ornamental garden was too high for Sophie. Caroline staggered into Daniel's study, the room where she had photographed the incriminating insurance policy 6 weeks earlier. She had the proof of times, motive times, but she needed proof of times intent asterisk. She pulled out her phone, the glass screen reflecting her terrified, desperate face. She had to call the police, but the words stuck in her throat. "My husband is attempting to burn me alive for $5 million. I know this because he is currently pretending to be in Geneva, and I just saw a random man lock the service door." It sounded like the plot of a bad B-movie. Not a credible emergency. The police would ask for tangible, immediate danger, smoke, flames, a confession. They wouldn't send a tactical unit based on a suspicious life insurance policy and a handyman with a padlock. She was sealed in. The perfect Miller estate, built to endure a century, was now an airtight granite tomb. Caroline sank onto the Persian rug, clutching Sophie. The air inside the house had already begun to turn stale and thick, smelling of old dust and the chilling absence of oxygen. She had the photograph. She had Sophie. And she had the terrifying, absolute certainty that the countdown was nearing 0. All she lacked was a single, viable path to survival. Asterisk. We must feed the darkness to find the light, Mommy. Asterisk. Sophie's innocent, haunting words echoed in her mind. The Miller house was waiting to breathe its last. The stale air in Daniel's study was a physical weight, pressing down on Caroline's lungs. Yet her mind finally broke free from the loop of paralyzed fear. She couldn't afford hysteria. She had Sophie. Daniel had sealed them in, but he couldn't have accounted for every variable. He was a man of meticulous paperwork, arrogance, and routine. If anyone had left a trail, it was him. Setting Sophie gently down on the massive leather sofa, Caroline pressed a finger to her lips. Stay quiet, sweetie. Mommy is looking for a hidden key. She started with the obvious. Daniel's safe locked, naturally. His filing cabinets full of meaningless tax documents and aggressively organized receipts. The leather-bound diaries he kept, not confessions. Just tedious, self-aggrandizing accounts of market projections and supposed genius. The study was designed to exude power and transparency. A deliberate misdirection. Daniel always hid his true self in plain sight. Caroline swept the desk, running her hands along the mahogany and tracing the delicate, carved edges. She remembered Daniel often tapping his pen idly against the section immediately beneath the central drawer pull, a habit she had always found annoying. Now, she felt carefully, pressing where his fingers had rested. Asterisk. Click. Asterisk. A small, shallow panel on the underside of the desk facade sprang open, revealing a velvet-lined recess. It held exactly what a meticulous, paranoid criminal would use. 2 identical prepaid burner phones, their batteries charged and ready, and a crisp, folded printout from a private air charter service. Caroline unfolded the paper, her hands shaking so violently she had to brace them on the desk. The itinerary was short and brutally concise. A chartered flight from Portland to a small private airstrip near Bangor, Maine, and back. Departure 3 hours before the house was sealed. Return scheduled for 2 days hence. Geneva was a lie. Daniel hadn't left the state. He had simply driven a short distance, waited for his accomplice to finish sealing the house, and was now relaxing in the relative anonymity of a remote location, ready to return in 48 hours to play the grieving widower for the cameras. Safe in the knowledge that by then, all trace of the truth would be incinerated. He was close. He was waiting. The realization was colder and harder than the polished granite of the house itself. Caroline pocketed the phones and the printout, the evidence feeling both flimsy and immensely heavy. It was enough to tell the police, but she still lacked the means of escape. She turned to Sophie, who was curled up on the sofa, not crying or shaking, but deeply absorbed in drawing on a notepad she had found among Daniel's office supplies. Sophie used a thick black marker, creating lines that were stark against the white paper. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Caroline asked gently, trying to keep the frantic edge out of her voice. Sophie didn't look up. "The house, Mommy. But the bones are different." Caroline leaned over. The drawing was immediately unsettling. It was an accurate sketch of the exterior of the Miller estate, heavy and imposing. But Sophie had focused on the interior structure, drawing thick, black lines representing the walls. In the center, exactly where the pantry was located, she hadn't drawn solid wall. Instead, there was a dense spiral of black ink that looked like a deep, echoing hole, and leading away from the hole, hidden under the heavy marker lines, was a faint, segmented tunnel, a path. Next to the tunnel, Sophie had drawn a small, stylized symbol that Caroline instantly recognized. The coiled serpent that had been carved into the antique safe box Grandma had left her, the symbol Grandma had told her was meant to guard the truth of the foundations. Below the drawing, written in Sophie's careful, 6-year-old cursive, was the phrase Grandma had often repeated, translated into English, "*, the darkness breathes." Push the stone where the serpent sleeps. Asterisk. Caroline stared at the picture, the fear finally giving way to a frantic, directed hope. Grandma's cryptic notes, Daniel's obsessive renovations, the locked doors, and Sophie's unnerving calm. It all coalesced. The secret wasn't a metaphor for survival. It was a physical mechanism. The pantry, Sophie, Caroline murmured, scooping up the child and pressing a desperate kiss to her smoky hair. Show Mommy the stone. The faint, unmistakable smell of burned wood and hot oil drifted up through the floorboards. The gasoline accelerant had been ignited. And the fire was no longer a threat contained to the basement. It was hungry, and it was climbing. The countdown was over. They ran, not toward the sealed safety of the upstairs, but back down the curving main staircase, moving toward the kitchen wing, toward the deep black spiral of Sophie's drawing, toward the wall Caroline had just dismissed as solid, unyielding granite. They ran toward the pantry, toward the one small chance that Daniel Miller, in his arrogance, had failed to seal the history of the house as thoroughly as he had sealed its doors. They reached the ground floor, and the air hit Caroline like a physical blow, heavy, thick with the noxious sweetness of burning oil, a smell far more sinister than simple smoke. It wasn't the comforting scent of a chimney fire. This was the engineered stink of accelerant, a chemical promise of rapid, total destruction. The heat, radiating up from the unseen depths of the basement, made the floorboards beneath their feet feel unnervingly springy. Already surrendering to the inferno below, the realization settled in Caroline's gut, cold and sickening. Overriding the fear of the secret tunnel, Daniel hadn't just intended to set a fire. He had engineered a conflagration. He wanted the house, and them with it, gone within the hour. The smoke was now pouring into the main corridor through the ventilation grates, curling around the edges of the thick antique rugs. It was too dense to breathe standing up. Caroline dropped to her knees, pulling Sophie down with her. The path to the kitchen wing, and the pantry, was becoming obscured by choking blackness. "We need to get higher, sweetie," Caroline choked out, her throat already raw, driven by the frantic, futile hope that she could find air. Or, impossibly, a way to break the seal. They couldn't stay on the ground floor, pressed between the rising heat and the sealed exits. She scrambled back up the short service stairs leading toward the second-floor bedrooms. Sophie's room was the highest point in the house, facing the back garden, the furthest point from the basement inferno. They burst into the room. It was miraculously clear of smoke for the moment, a small, brief sanctuary. But the window here offered no better hope of escape. It was locked and bolted from the outside, too high for a desperate fall. Caroline grabbed the heavy velvet quilt from Sophie's bed and wrapped it tightly around the child's small frame. A futile gesture against the coming heat. Her eyes darted around, searching for the one modern tool Daniel's meticulous planning might have overlooked. The landline telephone. She stumbled to the bedside table, snatching the receiver, her fingers slick with sweat. She frantically jabbed at the 9 button, the number vibrating under her thumb. Asterisk dial tone. Asterisk, relief, sharp and overwhelming, flooded her. Daniel hadn't cut the hard lines, only the exterior security system. She punched 911. The phone rang once, twice. Then, instead of the urgent voice of the dispatcher, there was only a flat, dead times click asterisk. Silence. Caroline tried again, pressing the numbers with desperate fury. Click, click, click. He had left the landline in place, knowing exactly when the blaze would engulf the wires in the basement, severing the connection just as the victims, trapped and panicked, finally reached for help. He hadn't cut the line. He had timed the fire to do it for him. It was a final, cruel flourish of control. "Mommy, the fire alarm is ringing downstairs," Sophie whispered from inside the quilt cocoon. The high, insistent shriek of the smoke detector, faint but unmistakable, confirmed that the flames had reached the first floor. The race was over. They had failed to find a conventional exit, and communication was severed. Survival now hinged entirely on the cryptic secrets of the long-dead grandma. Caroline dropped the dead phone receiver and scooped Sophie into her arms. The heat in the room was rising rapidly, pushing through the floorboards. A thick, palpable pressure. To the pantry now, Sophie. Caroline gasped, her voice hoarse. Show me the stone. She bolted back down the stairs, ignoring the blinding smoke that now filled the lower hallway. They had run toward the known sealed exits, and found only concrete proof of their doom. Now, they were running toward the impossible, a single, hidden door in a century-old wall, their last, terrifying prayer. They hit the ground floor, and the transformation was complete. The Miller estate was no longer a house. It was a kiln. The air was a tangible weapon, scalding Caroline's skin through her thin clothes. A terrifying orange glow pulsed from the far end of the corridor near the main living room, illuminating swirling clouds of black smoke that raced toward them like liquid ink. The smell of burning lacquer and ancient wood was overwhelming, eclipsing the chemical stench of the accelerant, signaling that the structural integrity of the house was now truly compromised. The high-pitched shriek of the fire alarm was now deafening, vibrating deep in Caroline's chest, a constant shrill reminder that their final minutes were ticking away. Caroline stumbled, using the wall for support. Nearly blind, she pulled Sophie tighter against her hip, whispering prayers she didn't know she believed in. The pantry, Mommy. Asterisk. Quickly. Asterisk. Sophie's voice cut through the chaos, still unnervingly clear, like a tiny bell ringing in a tempest. They reached the kitchen wing. The smoke here was less dense only because the heat was too extreme for it to settle. The pantry door was slightly ajar, having been left that way earlier in the day. Caroline shoved it open, shoving them both inside. The pantry was small, a 6-by-6-foot cubicle lined with shelving. It was momentarily safer, shielded by the thick stone walls. But the heat pressing against the kitchen door was rapidly building, and the low roar of the fire was impossibly close. Caroline slammed the door shut, cutting off the immediate sight of the flames, plunging them into oppressive semi-darkness broken only by the thin light filtering from the small, dusty window near the ceiling. She dropped Sophie, who immediately pointed a steady finger toward the back wall. There, the child insisted. Grandma said we must be smaller than the stone. Caroline's panic had been replaced by a desperate, surgical focus. This was no time for doubt. She pushed the heavy shelving unit holding canned goods aside with a superhuman surge of adrenaline. It grated across the stone floor, revealing the plaster wall behind it. The same solid surface she had dismissed hours ago. She pressed her palm against the plaster. Cold. Unyielding. There was no seam, no door, no latch, just the ancient, unforgiving structure of the Miller estate. Sophie, where? Tell me exactly. Caroline's voice was a ragged croak. Sophie stepped closer, running her fingers along the plaster just above her head. Exactly where she had drawn the black spiral on the paper in Daniel's study. The stone where the serpent sleeps, Mommy. Sophie repeated, using her small, steady finger to trace a very faint, almost microscopic hairline crack in the surface. Running horizontally across the wall at hip height, Caroline sank to her knees, following the line. She squinted, forcing her smoke-stung eyes to focus. She wasn't looking at plaster, she was looking at the original granite structure, covered by thin layers of paint and stucco, but the foundation blocks were visible beneath. In the center of the hairline, low down, where the mortar should have been smooth, there was a small, roughly carved section. It wasn't a brick, it was a stone block, slightly darker than the others, and imprinted faintly into the dusty surface. Caroline saw the shape, a shallow, worn carving that matched the symbol on Grandma's safe box. The coiled serpent. Asterisk. Push the stone where the serpent sleeps. Asterisk. Caroline pressed the spot with the heel of her hand. Nothing. She pushed harder, leaning her entire body weight against the stone. The granite block didn't move inward. Instead, it clicked outward. A low, grinding sound of gears long unused, and a small, rusted iron ring sprang free from the stone. At the same instant, the wall, which had seemed so solid, shuddered. A thick plume of smoke, hotter and far more noxious than the air in the pantry, burst from the bottom of the wall, carrying with it a terrifying concentrated blast of heat. The fire was right behind the stone. Caroline didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ring, her fingers slick with sweat and grime, and pulled with every last shred of her strength. The central section of the pantry wall, a 4-foot-wide section of stone, didn't swing or slide. It slowly, agonizingly, pivoted inward on a massive, hidden hinge, grinding against the floor with a sound like a coffin being dragged. As the stone moved, it revealed the absolute antithesis of the burning house. A narrow, black maw leading down. The air that rushed out was damp, cold, and smelled strongly of wet earth and mildew, the ancient, undisturbed breath of the ground beneath the Miller estate. The heat was now unbearable. The wood of the pantry door behind them began to hiss, the paint bubbling and turning black. "Go, Sophie, go, now!" Caroline lifted her daughter, not even looking to see how far the drop was. She shoved the child into the opening, trusting the darkness more than the devastating heat engulfing the room. Sophie tumbled onto unseen steps, letting out a small, winded yelp, but immediately scrambling to her feet in the darkness. Caroline pressed herself through the tight opening, just as the pantry door behind them burst open, admitting a shocking, blinding curtain of fire that instantly incinerated the shelves and their contents. The roaring sound of the freed fire was monstrous, right at her back. She reached down, found Sophie's warm, small hand, and pulled the iron ring one last time, yanking the heavy stone panel back into place. Asterisk, thud. Asterisk. The grinding mechanism seized, the panel sealing shut with a deafening final sound, trapping them in absolute, lightless darkness. The roar of the flames was suddenly muffled, receding to a furious, frustrated moan above them, but the heat was already radiating through the thick stone, warning them not to linger. Caroline dropped to her knees, pulling Sophie against her, breathing in the cold, damp, life-saving air of the forgotten tunnel. Daniel had sealed the house, but he had failed to seal the history of the foundation. They were alive, hidden within the bones of the house he had tried to burn. "Thank you, Grandma," Caroline whispered into the crushing darkness, gripping the tiny hand that had led her to safety. They were in a stairwell, steep and tight, constructed of rough-hewn, damp stone. There was no light, only the sound of their ragged breathing, and the distant, hungry crackle of the fire consuming everything they had owned above them. "Which way, sweetie?" Caroline asked, her voice shaking violently now that the immediate adrenaline had passed. "Down," Sophie stated simply, pulling Caroline's hand toward the descent. "Grandma said, the light is always found under the darkest roots." Caroline obeyed, unable to see anything, trusting only the small, insistent warmth of Sophie's grip. The descent was immediate and treacherous. The steps were uneven blocks of rough-cut granite, slick with decades of cold underground moisture. The air was a heavy, earthy blanket, a stark, life-saving contrast to the suffocating smoke they had just escaped, but the ceiling was terrifyingly low. Caroline had to fold herself almost double, her shoulders scraping against the mossy stone walls on either side. The space was barely wide enough for one person. It was an ancient artery of the house, perhaps a smuggler's route or a panic room built by a long-dead miller. Above them, the heat was not just radiating, it was actively pushing through the cracks in the masonry. Dust and tiny flakes of burning debris occasionally drifted down, landing on Caroline's hair, momentarily smelling of ash and chemical fire before being quenched by the damp tunnel air. Every foot they descended felt like an eternity. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs, not just from the exertion of climbing while crouched over, but from the crushing weight of the earth around them. She imagined the tons of stone and timber of the Miller estate collapsing, burying them alive in this granite coffin. She moved solely by instinct and the constant, unnervingly steady pressure of Sophie's small hand guiding her through the gloom. The sounds of the inferno were now muted, yet chillingly defined. They heard a dreadful, grinding crack times from directly above the sound of an antique beam surrendering to the heat. Then, A sickening times whoosh times followed by a rush of displaced air, suggesting a major section of the first-floor ceiling or a wall had collapsed. Caroline gasped, pulling Sophie momentarily close, trying to shield the child from the inevitable tremors. "We are going fast, Mommy," Sophie whispered, seemingly oblivious to the seismic trauma, treating the descent like an urgent game. "Grandma says the serpent's tongue is long, and it goes all the way to the roots." Caroline tried to speak, to comfort Sophie, but her voice died in her throat, choked by the damp air and the terror of the confinement. She could only focus on the rhythmic scraping of her shoes against the rough stone and the distant metallic scent of rising groundwater. The tunnel was curving now, turning from a steep stairwell into a narrow, horizontal passage. The air grew significantly colder, proving they were moving away from the immediate heat source and deeper under the earth. The passage was braced by massive, ancient wooden supports, black with rot and moisture, running parallel to the ground. This wasn't a modern construction. It was a rough, centuries-old escape route, designed before the house became the showpiece Daniel had tried to destroy. The passage seemed endless. Caroline's knees were raw, her back ached from the continuous crouch, and the claustrophobia was a living thing, squeezing the breath from her chest. She had survived the fire, only to be crushed by the granite foundation. Suddenly, Sophie stopped. "This is the last route, Mommy," she said. Caroline bumped into her daughter, peering forward uselessly. Her eyes were useless in the absolute blackness. She reached out, feeling ahead, and found not more stone or damp earth, but rough wood, a heavy, horizontal barrier that sealed the end of the tunnel. A trapdoor. She ran her hands over the surface. It was reinforced with iron bands and clearly secured from the inside by some latch mechanism. Her fingers brushed against a cold, smooth handle. A recessed iron pull, disguised by years of sediment and grime. She pulled the latch. It didn't budge. Daniel must have found and secured this too, perhaps during his final phases of renovation. The terror flared again, sharp and debilitating. Had they exchanged one tomb for another, merely delaying the inevitable burial? "No, Mommy." "Outside," Sophie instructed, pointing to a spot near the bottom corner of the wooden barrier. "Grandma said we must tickle the light." Caroline moved her fingers to the designated spot, feeling around the heavy wood until she found a small, almost undetectable gap between the floor and the door frame. A tiny sliver of air, intensely fresher and sharper than the tunnel air, was leaking in. She pressed her thumb hard against the lower frame, feeling a loose mechanism hidden beneath the rot. Asterisk. Creak. Asterisk. With a violent shuddering groan that echoed eerily in the confined space, the latch released. Caroline threw her shoulder against the heavy wooden door, pushing up. It moved just enough for a blast of intensely cold, sweet night air to rush in, carrying the clean scent of pine needles, wet dirt, and something metallic and ominous. The distant, unmistakable smell of a large burning building. Caroline shoved again, straining every muscle in her back, until the door swung up and outward with a final, echoing crash against unseen earth. She scrambled out, hauling Sophie after her, pushing through a dense tangle of heavy vines and overgrown scrub brush that had been concealing the exit for decades. They emerged not into a basement or a courtyard, but onto the cold, damp earth of the forested grounds, several yards from the main structure. The trapdoor they had just used lay flat on the ground, instantly concealed beneath the heavy, intertwining ivy and the blackness of the night. Caroline pulled Sophie tight, collapsing onto the grass, coughing violently as her lungs processed the clean, cold air. She looked back toward the house. The Miller estate was a blazing, horrifying silhouette against the dark sky. Flames were pouring from the lower windows, licking up the granite facade, illuminating the smoke that billowed into the main night. The grand home Daniel had tried to claim was being consumed, magnificent and terrible in its destruction. They were alive. They were out. "We need to go far, Mommy," Sophie said, her small voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "Daniel might come back to watch." The cold hit Caroline with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, brutal shock to lungs accustomed to suffocating heat. She lay on the frozen, damp earth, hacking up the remaining smoke, the taste of ash and adrenaline bitter on her tongue. The Maine night air, thick with the scent of pine and oncoming snow, was a relief. But the sight beyond the thicket of ivy was not. The Miller estate, only moments ago a silent, beautiful cage, was now a violent, roaring furnace. Flames, no longer contained, burst from the first-floor windows in vivid orange plumes, licking the granite facade and climbing toward the roofline. The heat they generated was immense, radiating toward them even from 50 yards away, casting erratic, horrifying shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The grand house that had been the backdrop to her prison was consuming itself, magnificent and terrifying in its self-destruction. Caroline scrambled to her knees, pulling Sophie close. The child was silent, tucked tightly into the thick velvet quilt Caroline had wrapped her in earlier. "We have to run, sweetie, now," Caroline gasped, her voice raw. They ran blindly across the frozen grass, away from the terrifying spectacle and the growing, hungry roar of the fire. Caroline's feet pounded against the uneven ground, focused only on reaching the boundary of the Miller property. Daniel's isolation plan had worked perfectly. The estate was set far back from the road, surrounded by dense woods designed to grant privacy, or in this case, a clean execution. They reached the edge of the Miller fence line, collapsing onto the hard shoulder of the quiet access road. Across the road, maybe 200 yards down, sat the familiar, modest bungalow of the O'Malley family, the closest neighbors. A small light was visible in the kitchen window, a sign of normal, waking life. Caroline pressed a desperate kiss to Sophie's head. "Stay quiet, sweetie. Don't move from this spot. Mommy will be right back." Caroline stumbled toward the O'Malley house, moving with a desperate, clumsy urgency, pounding on the front door with frantic, raw knuckles. It took only seconds, but felt like an hour. A cautious Mrs. O'Malley, elderly and confused by the late-night racket, opened the door, her eyes widening in horror at the sight of the wild-eyed, ash-stained woman on her porch. "My house," Caroline choked out, pointing frantically back across the darkness where the glow of the fire was now visible, a hellish corona over the trees. "Please, call 911. The whole place is on fire. My husband, Daniel Miller, he locked us in. He tried to burn us alive." Mrs. O'Malley, trained by decades of small-town emergency prep, didn't argue or question the impossible accusation. She immediately grabbed the landline, dialing as she led Caroline and the unnaturally silent Sophie inside, wrapping thick, knitted blankets around their shaking shoulders. 911? "Yes. I need the fire department and police immediately. The Miller estate. The whole place is engulfed." The neighbor's voice rose, tight with alarm. "Yes. And the mother says it was arson. Her husband. He locked them in. Please hurry." Within minutes, the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing rapidly louder as the heavy engines fought their way up the secluded lane. The O'Malley front window was suddenly alive with flashing red and blue lights, painting the quiet living room in frantic colors. Firefighters poured out of the trucks, grappling with hoses, their movements professional and urgent as they navigated the burning ruins. But close behind them, in an unmarked black sedan, was Lieutenant Ben Harris of the Portland Police Department. Harris, a weary man with a meticulous eye for detail, was the lead detective on shift. The dispatcher's call mentioning arson and locked doors had pulled him from his warm home. He knew immediately this was far more than a simple structure fire. Harris found Caroline huddled inside the O'Malley's warm living room, wrapped in a floral blanket, holding Sophie protectively. He knelt before her, keeping his voice low and steady despite the chaos exploding 50 yards away. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Lieutenant Harris. We need to treat your injuries. But first, I need you to tell me exactly what happened at your house." Caroline's story tumbled out, frantic and disjointed. The massive insurance policy, the fake trip to Geneva, the strange contractor, the padlocks, the thick, oily smoke. And finally, the ancient hidden door. She was shaking uncontrollably. Not from the cold, but from the horrifying clarity of the past few days finally aligning into a single, deadly plot. Harris listened patiently, his gaze flickering between the terrified mother and the unnervingly quiet child. His initial professional skepticism dissolved when his radio crackled with a report from the scene. A fireman's voice, rough with exertion, reported directly to him. "Lieutenant, we've cut the chain on the main service door. Heavy duty, set from the outside, and the fire chief confirms accelerant use in the basement." This was professionally set. It was a human fire trap. Harris looked back at Caroline, the accusation in his eyes replaced by a terrible, absolute certainty. He touched her shoulder gently, confirming his immediate suspicion. "Mrs. Miller? Where is your husband, Daniel Miller, right now?" Caroline swallowed hard, the bitterness of betrayal coating her throat. "He told me Geneva, but he lied. I found his itinerary, a private flight near Bangor. He's nearby, waiting for us to be gone." The detective's jaw tightened. "All right, we have a clear case of attempted double murder and arson. We need to get you and Sophie to the hospital for treatment and a formal statement. But first," he paused, pulling out a small notepad, "when you realized the danger, you said you found evidence of his motive. Financial motive. Did you keep it?" Caroline reached instinctively for the phone secured in the waistband of her smoky nightgown. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out, navigating the interface with practiced haste. "The policy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the increasing roar of the fire outside. "He bought it 4 weeks ago, $5 million. I photographed the whole thing." She held up the phone, the small screen illuminating the damning image. Bold black print confirming the figure, $5 million, and the single chilling name listed under beneficiary, Daniel Miller, husband. Lieutenant Harris studied the photograph under the dim kitchen light. He had seen the charred wreckage of the Miller estate, the heavy external locks, and the traumatized survivor. This photograph, clear and undeniable, provided the motive. The entire scope of the crime, from opportunistic murder to elaborate financial conspiracy, suddenly snapped into focus. "Mrs. Miller," Harris said, rising quickly, his professional calm returning with lethal intensity, "we're going to get you and your daughter safe, and we're going to find Daniel Miller." The world outside the confines of the O'Malley's familiar kitchen dissolved into a high-speed blur of ambulance lights, official urgency, and the acrid smell of burning wood clinging stubbornly to their clothes. Paramedics moved Caroline and Sophie with detached efficiency, their focus entirely on assessing the smoke inhalation and ensuring the child, still unnervingly quiet, was stable. At the Portland Medical Center, the sterile smell of disinfectant was a sharp, merciful contrast to the noxious oily fumes of the inferno they had left behind. Sophie, wrapped tightly in a thick hospital blanket, was given a mild sedative to manage her shock. Caroline refused anything more than basic observation and a large glass of water. She needed to be clear-headed. Her battle had shifted from survival to prosecution. Lieutenant Harris arrived half an hour later, finding Caroline seated rigidly on a low cot, staring at the blurry image of her daughter asleep under monitoring equipment. He was wearing a dark, rumpled blazer and held a steaming styrofoam cup, his demeanor respectful and steadying. He didn't start with accusatory questions, but with quiet reassurance. "Mrs. Miller, what you went through is unimaginable. We have teams at the scene, and preliminary findings confirm the use of accelerants and external locking mechanisms. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated." Caroline nodded, the words tasting like ash. "He calculated everything except Grandma's secrets." Harris pulled up a small stool, his expression grave. "I understand you have information regarding the motive." Her fingers, still slightly swollen and scraped from grappling with the hidden door, went immediately to her phone. She pulled up the secure folder, the screen glowing brightly in the dim hospital light. "This is it, Lieutenant," she said, tilting the screen so he could clearly see the high-resolution photograph. $5 million. Purchased immediately after my mother passed away, When the inheritance officially transferred to me, he made himself the sole beneficiary. Harris took the phone, holding it close to examine the details. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic beep of Sophie's heart monitor. The weight of the photographic evidence was palpable, bridging the gap between a panicked accusation and a tangible crime. "This changes everything, Mrs. Miller," Harris confirmed, his voice low and professional. "We moved quickly when we got the report about the locked doors. A double homicide investigation is already underway, but the policy provides the clear financial motive we need to ensure this sticks as attempted murder and conspiracy." He handed the phone back, his eyes sharp with new focus. "You also mentioned an itinerary. You said Mr. Miller did not go to Geneva." "It was a lie," Caroline stated, the certainty in her voice cold and unshakable. "I found printouts for a private charter flight near Bangor, a quick trip, designed to make him look preoccupied and miles away, when in reality, he was likely only a short drive from the house, waiting for the smoke." Harris didn't seem surprised. Rather, he seemed grimly satisfied. "My team was running the coordinates you provided the O'Malley's dispatcher. We cross-referenced air traffic data and reviewed CCTV from the service entrance of a private hangar near Bangor this afternoon. We have confirmation. Mr. Miller's black sedan was parked there, fully secured. He was seen driving it away less than 3 hours before the first 911 call came in about the fire." A chilling wave of confirmation washed over Caroline. Daniel hadn't been on another continent. He had been nearby, calculating the minutes until his wife and daughter were reduced to cinders, poised to return and play the grieving husband. His meticulous planning was now the very evidence that would condemn him. He didn't even need an accomplice for the fire itself, did he? Caroline realized, a tremor of pure revulsion passing through her. He just needed someone to lock the doors and set the mechanism. He waited for the house to do the rest. "Precisely," Harris said. "He built a perfect alibi and a perfect trap. But the locked doors and this policy photo destroy the alibi, and the fact that you and Sophie escaped destroys the trap." He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "We have warrants being drafted right now. We are tracking his movements. But we need one last piece, Mrs. Miller." The initial report mentioned his mother, Evelyn Miller, was involved in the conspiracy. Caroline bit her lip, glancing at Sophie's pale face. Evelyn's involvement, her cold encouragement of Daniel's actions, was a separate layer of betrayal. Yes, Evelyn was the constant presence, the one who isolated me, who urged me to sign everything Daniel put in front of me. Sophie overheard them talking, a few weeks ago, about making the fire look like an accident, about getting rid of the two of us. Caroline took a shaky breath. "Sophie is the only true witness to that." Harris looked toward the sleeping child, his expression softening slightly. "I understand how sensitive this is. We will have a child psychologist present, and we will proceed with the utmost care. But for the conspiracy charge to hold, and for justice to be absolute, we need her statement." Caroline reached out and gently stroked Sophie's hair, the velvet quilt soft beneath her touch. Sophie, the one who had seen through the facade and followed the ghost of her grandmother's warning, was now the key to dismantling Daniel's fortress of lies. "She saved our lives, Lieutenant," Caroline whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "She will speak. When she wakes up, she will tell you everything." The light in Sophie's room was filtered and soft, designed not to disturb. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open, clear and calm despite the lingering pallor of smoke exposure. She looked past the IV stand and the monitoring equipment straight into Caroline's face, and offered a small, tired smile. "Mommy," she whispered, "we are safe now." Dr. Michael Hayes, the child psychologist Lieutenant Harris had called in, was a man whose calming presence seemed to counteract the sterile severity of the hospital. He had a quiet, even voice and moved with a careful slowness that didn't feel condescending, but genuinely respectful of the child's pace. The formal interview was conducted in a small, windowless conference room adjacent to Sophie's hospital suite. Lieutenant Harris was present, sitting at the far end of the table, his demeanor professional and unreadable. Dr. Hayes occupied the space closest to Sophie, who was settled comfortably in a beanbag chair, clutching the velvet quilt from the burning house. Caroline sat slightly behind her daughter, a silent guardian, her presence a necessary anchor for Sophie's fragile sense of safety. Dr. Hayes did not begin with the fire. He began with drawing. He asked Sophie about her grandma, encouraging her to fill the white paper with memories of color and warmth, allowing the connection that had saved their lives to be the focus. Sophie drew Grandma's garden, filled with impossible purple flowers, and a large, smiling sundae. It was only after nearly 20 minutes of building trust that Dr. Hayes gently introduced the Miller house. He used small wooden figurines, one representing a worried mommy, one a serious Daniel, and one a very rigid, tall Evelyn. "Sophie," Dr. Hayes asked, his voice low and soothing, "do you remember seeing Daniel and Evelyn talking about things that made Grandma unhappy?" Sophie was slow to respond. She picked up the Evelyn figurine, tapping it against the table with deliberate precision. "Evelyn always had cold words," Sophie murmured, her gaze fixed on the plastic toy. "She told Daniel that Mommy was too slow." Caroline felt a wave of protective fury, but kept her expression neutral, remembering Harris's earlier warning. Asterisk. "Do not interrupt." Asterisk. "And what did Daniel say to Evelyn?" Hayes prompted. Sophie hesitated, her small hands gripping the wooden figure tightly. "They were in the library." Daniel was loud first. He said, "We can't wait for her to come around. The policy is active, Mother." Caroline's breath hitched. Asterisk. "The policy." Asterisk. "The official language of the crime." "Did you know what the policy meant?" Dr. Hayes asked. Sophie shook her head, focusing intently on the next part of her memory. "No. But Evelyn said, 'We must make it look like an accident, Daniel. A terrible, tragic electrical failure. No one must know we helped them along.'" Hayes nodded, encouraging her. "And who were them?" Sophie finally looked up, her expression utterly grave and chillingly devoid of emotion. "Me and Mommy. They said we needed to be gotten rid of, because of the papers, and because Grandma had made too many secrets." She pushed the Daniel and Evelyn figures together on the table, then used her hand to sweep them away, knocking them into a neat pile at the edge of the table. "Grandma said they were trying to feed the darkness," Sophie explained, her eyes wide and clear. "She said they would use the fire but they would not get the bones of the house. She said that's why Daniel had to lock all the doors to make sure we stayed for the fire." Caroline closed her eyes briefly, a tear tracing a hot path through the soot smudges still on her cheek. It was not just the overheard conversation that was damning. It was the chilling, clinical way Sophie connected the dots, linking the verbal conspiracy to the physical execution of the crime, the locked doors Daniel had used to seal their fate. The testimony lasted barely 20 minutes, but it was concise, credible, and horrifyingly detailed. The quiet authority with which Sophie spoke about the darkness, the policy, and the necessary finality of the locked doors provided the exact context Lieutenant Harris needed to elevate the charges from mere suspicion to airtight evidence. When Dr. Hayes signaled the end, gently reassuring Sophie she had been very brave, Lieutenant Harris rose immediately. He walked to Caroline, placing a hand on the back of her chair. "Mrs. Miller, Sophie's testimony, combined with the accelerants found at the scene, the external padlocks, the fake itinerary, and your photograph of the policy, provides a comprehensive, undeniable chain of evidence," Harris said, his voice hard with professional resolve. "We have everything we need." He glanced at his phone, which had just vibrated silently. "The search warrants have been secured. We are issuing immediate arrest warrants for Daniel Miller and Evelyn Miller on charges of attempted double murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit fraud." A profound, bone-deep sense of relief, cold and cleansing, washed over Caroline, replacing the searing heat of fear. Justice, which had seemed an impossible, distant dream while she was trapped inside the burning granite walls, was finally moving. "Where is he?" Caroline asked, her voice steady now. Harris offered a grim smile. The private airstrip surveillance confirmed Mr. Miller was scheduled to return tomorrow morning, hoping to arrive to a tidy crime scene and a sympathetic police force. We have already preempted his return. The arresting officers are waiting at the terminal. As for Evelyn, Harris knew the habits of old money. Mrs. Miller told my team she was likely spending the day at the Portland Golf and Country Club, making herself conspicuously available for condolence calls. She should be collected within the hour. Caroline looked down at Sophie, who was already drifting back to sleep, exhausted but safe. Daniel had planned his grand, lucrative exit, ensuring his freedom and wealth while his family burned. But in his arrogance, he had underestimated the silent wisdom passed down through generations. A wisdom that had left him exposed and criminally naked before the law. The trap was sprung. The chase was over. Now, they waited for the Millers to fall. The profound, chilling certainty that justice was finally in motion settled over Caroline, replacing the adrenaline that had kept her standing. The police were moving, the siege was over, and the hunters were now the hunted. The official confirmation came not through a clinical phone call from Lieutenant Harris, but through a fragmented, breathless report on the hospital television the next morning. Daniel Miller, looking pale and furious, not grieving, was captured trying to retrieve his luggage at the private Bangor terminal, still attempting to play the role of the concerned executive rushing home from an interrupted business trip. The image of the police snapping handcuffs around the pristine cuffs of his expensive white shirt was a moment of cold, unadulterated triumph for Caroline. Evelyn's arrest was, fittingly, more dramatic. She was apprehended in the sunlit lounge of the Portland Golf and Country Club, mid-sentence, while accepting a glass of chilled champagne from a waiter and regaling a small crowd of her social peers with tales of her poor, sweet, tragically lost daughter-in-law and granddaughter. The headlines that followed: Times socialite matriarch and wealthy son arrested in arson plot. Times ensured that the perfect Miller facade was not just cracked, but irrevocably smashed across the state of Maine. For Caroline and Sophie, the weeks that followed were a blur of sterile temporary housing, interviews with the prosecutor's office, and the persistent, low-level grief over the loss of their home, not the granite structure, but the life they had tried to build within it. The Miller estate was a total loss, the fire having consumed every floor, leaving only a charred husk standing as a monument to Daniel's greed. The legal proceedings were swift, driven by the strength of the physical evidence and the chilling clarity of Sophie's testimony. Daniel and Evelyn chose to fight the charges, clinging to a desperate narrative of accidental fire, and Caroline's hysterical financial paranoia rooted in grief. The courtroom became the final stage for the Miller performance. Daniel, impeccably dressed and composed, sat at the defense table, his handsome features frozen in an expression of wounded indignation. He refused to look at Caroline, focusing instead on the ceiling or the judge, treating the entire process as an unfortunate interruption to his privileged life. Evelyn, radiating cold disdain, wore expensive black suits and a pearl necklace, portraying the martyred society woman, occasionally letting out soft, dramatic sighs designed to elicit sympathy from the jury. The most difficult day was Sophie's testimony. Through closed-circuit video, narrated gently by Dr. Hayes, Sophie recounted the sequence, the cold words about the policy, the overheard discussion of getting rid of the two of them, and the certainty that Daniel had fed the darkness. Her small, even voice, so devoid of artifice, cut through the polished lies of the Miller defense. Daniel finally looked at Caroline then, his eyes not contrite, but filled with absolute venomous hatred for the child who had destroyed his perfect plan. The jury returned the verdict after less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder in the first degree, arson, and conspiracy. When the final word was read, Evelyn gasped, a theatrical, calculated sound. But Daniel merely blinked, his composure cracking only slightly, revealing the raw shock of a man who genuinely believed his wealth and status placed him above the reach of the law. The sentencing hearing was a moment of profound gravity. The judge, addressing Daniel and Evelyn directly, spoke not just of the gravity of the attempted murder, but the unique cruelty of involving a child in the scheme, turning her home into a trap and her father into her executioner. Daniel Miller was sentenced to 40 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole. Evelyn Miller, due to her age and lesser physical involvement, received a sentence of 25 years for conspiracy and attempted murder, guaranteeing she would spend the rest of her calculated, privileged life behind bars. As Daniel was led away, his back ramrod straight, he finally locked eyes with Caroline. There was no remorse, only the icy fury of a thwarted predator, but Caroline met his gaze. Not with fear, but with a quiet, solid strength. She had lost her home, her marriage, and her security, but she had gained something immeasurably more valuable: the knowledge that she and Sophie were free, protected not by walls of granite or contracts of wealth, but by the fierce, intuitive love of a mother, and the warning of a grandmother whose loyalty transcended death. The Millers had fallen, not to fire, but to the truth they tried so desperately to bury. The finality of the judge's gavel was the only permission Caroline needed to physically dismantle the last vestiges of her former life. She sold what little of the Miller possessions the fire hadn't claimed: the salvaged antiques, the remaining investment portfolios that were cleanly separated from Daniel's fraudulent schemes, and severed every legal tie to the name. The ashes of the Granite estate were left behind, a smoking monument to greed, traded for a new beginning. They moved 300 miles south, settling in a small, weathered cottage nestled close to the rocky Maine coastline. The air here was clean, tasting of salt and sea spray, and the dominant sound was the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves, a constant, soothing rhythm utterly unlike the ominous, suffocating silence of the Miller house, or the shrill shriek of the fire alarms. In the small, sun-drenched living room, Caroline watched Sophie. The child was thriving, her trauma being meticulously and gently processed through the help of Dr. Hayes and the limitless safe boundaries Caroline now provided. Sophie no longer drew dark tunnels. Her sketches were filled with vibrant blues and greens, often depicting a sturdy boat sailing safely away from a distant, angry storm. Caroline took the remaining assets, the clean inheritance from her mother, untouched by Daniel's grasping hands, and channeled them into a new purpose. She established the Second Light Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and financial planning for survivors of domestic abuse, particularly those trapped by financial coercion and control. The mission was specific: to help women, isolated and intimidated like she had been, find the courage and the resources to sign the Times Right Times papers, not the wrong ones. She understood now that the inheritance had never been the money itself, but the knowledge her mother had left behind: a legacy of fierce independence and a refusal to be silenced. One evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and soft gold, Sophie curled into her side. "Mommy, the light is better here," Sophie observed, tracing the intricate pattern of Caroline's sweater. "It is, my love," Caroline agreed, pulling her daughter close. She thought of the hidden passageway, the stone that pivoted inward, and the absolute darkness that had saved them. The Millers had promised perfection built on granite and lies. Grandma had offered truth built on earth and hidden strength. Caroline knew their true family was not the bloodline Daniel and Evelyn had represented, but the unbroken connection that spanned generations, the silent, profound strength of her mother, and the intuitive, clear-eyed wisdom of her daughter. They had not merely survived the darkness, they had carried their own light out of it. Caroline kissed the top of Sophie's head, smelling the clean scent of the ocean in her hair. They had lost everything, but they had gained the world. They were finally, completely, safe. They looked forward, toward the horizon, where the sea and the sky met in a promise of endless possibility.